What is the best way to call for help in case of an emergency? How important is reliable gear? And are there critical items that you should bring duplicates of? I'm backpacking alone here in the Arizona desert in order to assess what gear you truly need in order to go on solo adventures. Temperatures are expected to be around 20 degrees Celsius during the day and 3 degrees Celsius overnight, with some potential for pretty strong winds. But the desert is unpredictable, and I've even been snowed on during above freezing forecasts, so anything could happen. There's 5 pieces of main gear that I'm gonna be assessing on this trip, and I'm gonna be focusing on safety, ease of use, and reliability. The first item I'm going to be testing is the iPhone, but more specifically, the newer models that have SOS and satellite capabilities. I hear a lot of chatter from people about how you don't necessarily need a dedicated SOS device anymore because the iPhone is going to be able to handle it for you. But I want to test how easy the SOS and satellite messaging is on the iPhone, how reliable it is, and then how it compares directly to the InReach. The other items that I'm going to be talking about are a tent, stove, water filter, and a sleeping pad. There's really 3 tests that I want to put the iPhone through. The first one is I want to get into that canyon and see if it can connect to satellite from in the confines of that space. The second test is I want to see if I can connect to the satellites under a lot of tree cover. And then the third test is to see how the iPhone compares to the InReach when it comes to the speed of sending and receiving messages. So I'm in a pretty canyony area right now. Definitely gets more canyony. I can see the sky pretty well. But let's see how the iPhone does in conditions like this, because this is not unheard of to have this much kind of enclosure when you're hiking in the desert. So step 1 is going to be connecting to the satellite. Try and get a clear view of the sky. So I just got a notification said, try and get a clear view of the horizon. The current satellite is low in the sky. Another satellite will be available in 7 minutes. Signal may be blocked. So unless the satellite comes right over top of me, I don't think it's going to be connecting. Okay, so this is breaking the iPhone. Let's see if the InReach messenger can connect from the exact same position. I haven't sent a message on the InReach in a while, so this might take a little bit in order for it to connect. It's a lot quicker once it's actually connected and sending messages, so we'll see. So right now it's a race. The InReach is still trying to send a message. The iPhone is waiting about 1 more minute. Oh, and the InReach sent. Whereas the iPhone is still waiting for another satellite to come about. It should be like any minute now. So we're just gonna wait and see if that allows the iPhone to connect and then send a message. But the InReach, it took about 5 minutes for it to send the message. Sometimes it just has a really weak connection, so it takes some time to send the data up to the satellites, whereas the iPhone isn't even connecting right now from the exact same position. So that was a really interesting test. I'll kind of do a 360 here. You can see how much sky I do have available to me, even though I am in a very low kind of canyony area. But the fact that the InReach was still able to send while the iPhone didn't even connect to the satellite a little bit in order to try and send a message is a pretty interesting result. I thought the iPhone would do a lot better because it's Apple. You'd think they'd just be sending satellites up all over the place in order to be able to get a good connection from anywhere. But the proof is in the pudding, and it looks like in this kind of scenario, the InReach is going to get the job done, whereas the iPhone, you'd kind of be pooched if you're trying to use it in an emergency right now. That has me really excited to see how the iPhone's gonna do under tree cover, as well as the speed test under clear skies compared to the InReach. But before we do that, I'm gonna talk about the water filter because I have some interesting thoughts on water filters that may be a little bit controversial. Found a couple little puddles here in order to grab water to filter, and even though the puddles don't look great, I'm gonna be using the Platypus Quick Draw filter. And I know a lot of you are giant nerds and you've watched all 6 hours of the Gear Skeptic YouTube videos about filters. And you're gonna say, well, the Sawyer Squeeze has removal rates multiple logs better than the Platypus Quick Draw, so it's a better filter overall. And I have a couple responses to that. First of all, I think the Platypus Quick Draw is good enough for most people in most circumstances. Platypus advertises that it meets EPA guidelines for removal of bacteria and protozoa, and I think those removal rates are going to be good even for conditions like this where the water isn't optimal. Second, I think Platypus tested their filters to meet EPA guidelines, so they took their filters, sent it to a lab and said, do our filters meet EPA guidelines? And the lab tested them and said, yes, they do. Whereas Sawyer, being maybe a little bit smarter in this regard, sent their filters in and said, what is the maximum removal rates our filters can achieve? The labs tested that and then came back with a higher removal rate. I want to test this theory myself by sending either water samples or the filters into a lab in order to get actually tested. But that's why I think that overall, there may not be as big of a difference between the Platypus and the Quick Draw as some people might think. And even if there is, I think the Platypus is good enough, like I said, for most people in most circumstances. But the reason why I like the Quick Draw more than the Sawyer Squeeze isn't because it potentially doesn't treat water as well. It's because It's faster in my experience, doesn't slow down quite as much as the Sawyer Squeeze does over time, and it's been super reliable for me. This is my third quick draw, and I put thousands of liters through the first two without any issues from a reliability standpoint, from a speed standpoint, and I never got sick. I'm also a big fan of the platypus bags, as well as the fact that you have two caps, so it's really easy to stopper it up, throw in your sleeping bag when temperatures do get below freezing. So this is where I'm gonna test the tree cover. It's nothing crazy, nothing like you'd see on the Appalachian Trail or even in some of the forested areas in the mountains before you get above tree line. But I am in a lower area. There is a tree kind of above me, some bushes all around me. So let's see if we can connect a satellite. So there's quite a bit of sky behind me, but the iPhone seemed to be wanting to be pointing that direction where there's a big tree. So let's see, get a clear view of the sky, looking for satellite. Okay, so want me to turn this way. There's a giant shrub right there. We'll see if I get the notification that there's things in the way or that there's not a clear view of the sky, because that's, okay, I connected. So this kind of environment with kind of some shrubby, minimal tree cover, it's okay for the iPhone. I will be curious to test it in areas where I have almost complete canopy cover, but I'm not gonna find that in the desert, so this is the best I could do. We made it to camp, and this camp is super beautiful. Really nice spot, I love it here. And I'm really excited to get camp set up and then test the stove, because I'm gonna be trying to push one of the most popular stoves on the market to failure. It's the BRS 3000, and it has this reputation of not being reliable, and I'm gonna put that to the test. Let's see if it actually is unreliable or if that's just hearsay. But first, let's talk about the X-Dome One Plus tent, because this is the tent that I brought on this trip because it's advertised as being lightweight, roomy inside, storm-worthy, and then user-friendly. But the big questions are, can it handle variable conditions, a lot of different environments? And then the really big question, is it reliable enough for solo trips like this? Because you might not have heard, but there's been a Durston Polegate 2.0 where there's been a bunch of issues with the tent poles for the X-Dome tents. So the tent uses carbon fiber poles and then has little aluminum tubes that connect each of the carbon fiber segments. And what's been happening is that those little aluminum tubes haven't been glued onto the carbon fiber poles well enough, and they've been coming loose and then causing big problems for people once they take the tent out into the backcountry. And I've personally experienced this problem. I was out on a 4-day trip, and one of the little aluminum ferrules, it came loose. Luckily, I knew this was a possibility, so I brought some super glue with me. I was able to fix it no problem, and it's been holding up just fine. But that is a reliability issue. Luckily, Dan Durston has gone to Easton, who makes these poles, and he said, hey guys, this is unacceptable. And Easton is doing a full recall of the tent poles and replacing them for everyone who bought the first batch of X-Domes. And then they're gonna rejig their entire manufacturing system and then make sure that for round 2 of the X-Dome, we're not gonna see this problem. For me, the X-Dome has been an amazing tent. It's becoming one of my favorite tents of all time because it's such a versatile tent. I've used it in winter conditions, I've used it in the desert here, I've used it in 3-season conditions, and it's performed well in all of those environments. It's also as advertised. It is roomy inside, it's easy to set up, and it's just an all-around great tent. I think the lesson here is that for key items like your tent, like your sleeping bag, like your sleeping pad, it's important to bring items with you that are tried and true, that you've used a bunch, you're familiar with, and you know are gonna hold up to the conditions. For me on solo adventures, I find interesting and unique gear makes my backpacking trips more enjoyable and fun. And my favorite place to get interesting gear is the sponsor of today's video, Garage Grown Gear. Some examples of some of my favorite interesting gear are this all-in-one repair kit from Ingenious Gear that has internal storage for a needle and patches. The sub 10 gram pumps from Garage Grown Gear are also amazing, like the Pad Pal and the Alpenblow. I bring the Pad Pal on pretty much every trip now. And then there's the mini thermometer that helps me track overnight lows for when I'm testing sleeping pads and top insulation. Definitely something I recommend if you're looking to dial in warm sleeps in the backcountry. Go check out these items as well as Garage Grown Gear down with the links in the video description. I mentioned that I'm testing a pad out on this trip, and it's the Thermarest X-Lite NXT. Thermarest claims that it's a reliable pad that goes through rigorous testing. And fun fact, Thermarest does inflate each pad that they produce at their factories in order to test for manufacturing defects and if there's any leaks in the pad. But does that testing lead to a pad that's more reliable? And is that reliability worth the trade-off for how questionable the comfort is with the X-Lite. From a reliability standpoint, I looked at reviews on Garage Your Own Gear, REI, basically all of the big retailers, and did a meta-analysis of the reliability of the X-Lite pads. With the X-Lite being one of the best-selling pads currently and of all time, there are going to be reviews where people are having issues. And what I found with my meta-analysis was that the biggest issues were usually with the old valves on the therm rests. They'd fail, they'd stop working, and that would lead to leaks. What's really cool with the new wing lock valves on the new therm rests is that it's really easy to replace them. So if you do end up with a faulty valve, you just swap it out for a new one and you're good to go. The other failure points were blown out baffles. So basically the baffles separating and then that causing issues. So I think that's a weld issue, which basically every manufacturer has. But personally, I haven't seen that many weld issues compared to pads like the Nemo Tensor and the Sea to Summit Etherlite XT. This is my second X-Lite and I've had multiple X-Therms as well, and I haven't had any issues with any of them, and that's with hundreds of nights on them. And that brings us to comfort, and I haven't been shy about saying how much I dislike the X-Lite as far as comfort goes. I find that the horizontal baffles lead to my arm going numb and falling asleep as I'm sleeping on my side, which is usually how I'm sleeping. I'm a side sleeper. There's just not a lot of good pressure relief with this pad. But with the NXT version, Thermrest increased the thickness from 3 inches to 3.5 inches. And what I'm curious to do on this trip is kind of play with that, because I know the Thermrest is a warm pad and temperatures tonight are only supposed to get down to about freezing on pretty warm ground here. So I know that it can handle those conditions. So I want to see if I deflate the pad a little bit, if I can improve pressure relief and improve comfort. I'm usually using pads fully inflated because that maximizes warmth, but the X-Lite has one of the best warmth to weight ratios on the market. So if I can kind of increase the comfort for around freezing or just above without getting cold, then that'll be a really big win for the X-Lite in my opinion. So the BRS stove, probably the most popular ultralight stove on the market because it weighs under an ounce. It's super compact, yet it works, it's effective. I've used this stove for hundreds of boils and it's worked every single time, almost. But like I mentioned, it has a bad reputation. So my question is, what sort of failure rates are actually happening with this stove? And then can I get it to fail? Because fun fact, I've actually had this specific stove fail on me before, but we'll get into that. So Amazon is probably the biggest seller of the BRS stove, and there's over 4,000 reviews on Amazon for the BRS. So I went and looked at all of the 1-star reviews and the 2-star reviews and picked out the ones where they're talking about the stove failing on them. I then analyzed them to see what was happening, what people were seeing from a failure perspective, and then if there's any way you can mitigate those failures. My big takeaway was that most failures were happening within the first or second boil, and what was usually happening were these arms were bending and basically dropping the pot off of the stove. And this is the same thing that happened to me when this stove failed on me. I had a 1-liter pot full of water on top of the stove, and there's a lot of wind blowing onto one of the arms, and that arm got really, really hot and then failed. Based on my research, the reason why this is happening only sometimes has to do with certain stoves and what sort of mix they're getting from the titanium alloy that the stove is made out of. So if there's more aluminum in the stove, then it's more likely that an arm is going to bend and then fail. Whereas if there's more titanium in the mix, it's less likely to fail. And the number that I saw from a failure rate perspective was about 5%, which is pretty high. Out of 4,000 stoves, 5% of them were failing on people. So keep that in mind. You have a 1 in 20 chance of your stove just failing and potentially dumping hot water on you. So what I recommend doing is when you first get a BRS stove, put a 1-liter full pot of water on top of the stove and then run it at full blast for about 15 minutes. If you can, get a fan or something and blow it into the side, and that'll create that wind effect, and that'll be a good stress test of the stove to see whether it'll fail on you. I was really excited to see if I could get the stove to fail. I found this nice rock that I'm going to put on top of it and then run the stove full blast for about 10 to 15 minutes. But then I realized I still need to make dinner tonight. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to have dinner and then we'll do the stress test. I have my meal rehydrating. It takes about 10 to 12 minutes, which is probably about the perfect amount of time in order to try and get this BRS stove to fail. So the plan is turn on the stove, put this, I don't know, 1.5 pound rock on top of it, wait 10 minutes, see if it fails. And we're gonna do it at full blast. All right, let's see what happens. So no failure with that test. I think the wind is a key factor because it really heats up the arms. When I was looking at it with the rock on top, it was only the feet at the top that were getting red hot. Whereas when it failed in the wind, it was this arm that was getting red hot, and I think it's just a little bit more of a weak point. So something to keep in mind, if you can't introduce wind when you're doing your stress test with a fan, then that's probably going to be a better test than just putting a bunch of water or weight on top of the stove and then heating it up. I am starving, so I'm gonna eat my meal right now and then probably get to bed really early because, as usual, I'm trying to catch up on sleep on this trip. And then tomorrow morning, I'll let you know how the X-Lite fared from a comfort and warmth standpoint. And then we'll do the speed test between the InReach and then the iPhone. Good morning. That was an interesting sleep, but it usually is when I'm testing gear. I've been messaging with Steffi Poo using both the InReach and the iPhone from inside the tent. So that was cool to see that the iPhone could still connect to satellites from within the tent with the fly all done up and everything. I'll do that speed test in a second, but first let's talk about how my sleep was on the X-Lite. The temperature got down to below -6 degrees Celsius last night, which was a lot colder than I was expecting. And that kind of factored into my approach to how I was sleeping. I started off with my sleeping pad at about 80–90% last night just so I could maximize warmth. Then I had both Alpha Direct upper and bottoms on, as well as socks, and then full fleece top and bottom as well, because it was cold. And my quilt that I was using, it's seen better days, even though it's rated to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I've used it for well over 100 nights without washing it so far, and it's definitely due. With the pad inflated to the 80–90% mark, I was definitely not comfortable. I was pretty okay when I was on my back, but when I tried to sleep on my side, my arm would start going numb and fall asleep within about 30 minutes, which is pretty par for the course for me on the X-Lites. So I did the logical thing and I let some air out of the pad, and I brought the pad all the way down to probably about 60% inflated, maybe even 50% inflated. And I've never really deflated the pad like this and then really paid attention to how I was feeling from a warmth and a comfort standpoint. And two interesting things happened. First of all, I did start feeling a little bit of heat loss through the pad, especially around my shoulders and my butt where I was compressing the pad a lot, which makes sense because, like I said yesterday, as you deflate the pad and make it thinner, you're decreasing its ability to keep you warm. The other thing that happened was my comfort did increase, especially when I was on my side. With that lower inflation level when I was on my side, it took about 3 hours for my arm to go numb and fall asleep, which is a big deal. If you can get 3 hours of solid sleep, uninterrupted sleep without waking up, then that's pretty good in the backcountry. It still doesn't compete with the super comfortable pads like the REI Helix, the Thermarest Neoloft, pads like that where I can get a full night's sleep without waking up, but it's a big improvement, especially when you get all the benefits of the warmth to weight ratio of the X-Lite. Well, maybe in this case, just the weight benefits because you are decreasing the warmth quite a bit by deflating it. Let's do a little test with the InReach versus iPhone under basically as clear of skies as you can get. I have the InReach right here, iPhone right here. Let's see if I can get a satellite connection. So I'm connected to the satellite on the iPhone. I have it pretty much locked on. So I'm gonna write the same message, just good, to Steph because she asked me how my morning's going. And I'm gonna press send at the same time, and let's see which one sends first. InReach sent. iPhone still, it's connected to the satellite, so we're still just waiting for it to send. That was seconds for the InReach, and then sent on the iPhone. So very quick with both. Let's see if I can write another message. Now that they're connected and sending, it might take even less time for the iPhone. So let's try this one again. Sent on the InReach, and then sent on the iPhone. So that was like, what, 1 or 2 seconds apart. So once they get going, not much of a difference between the iPhone and the InReach with sending and receiving messages. It's gonna be seconds. Once you start introducing different kinds of tree cover, canyon cover, the iPhone, based on my testing so far, seemed to kind of struggle a little bit, whereas the InReach could often find a satellite and then send the message off. An interesting aspect of the InReach, and I'm not sure if the iPhone is doing this, is if you are in an SOS situation, then the InReach actually boosts its signal. It decreases the battery life a little bit, but allows you to get a connection a lot more easily if you are in not ideal scenarios. So if the iPhone's doing that, that's great, but it's something to keep in mind with the InReach that even the testing that I'm doing now is gonna be not as good as if you actually were in an emergency. It's actually really cool to see the difference between the InReach and the iPhone. Where I think the InReach shines is if you're on multi-day trips that are very committing, it's just better to have that more reliable device. Also, if you're doing more dangerous activity, let's say you're rock climbing, mountain biking, then I think having something that you know you can connect to SOS services really easily with is gonna be kind of nice peace of mind. The third option is if you need to be able to receive messages, the InReach is gonna be able to do that a lot better. For the iPhone, you need to take it out, connect it to a satellite in order to receive messages. So Earlier in the year, when Steph was pregnant, I was still going out on trips, I really wanted her to be able to connect with me because I wanted to be able to run home if I needed to at the drop of a hat. And the InReach allowed me to have that peace of mind of knowing that she could connect to me. I'd get the ding from the InReach and it'd be no problem. I didn't have to be taking out my iPhone and checking every 5 minutes. The iPhone's gonna be a better option if you're just going out on things like day hikes in popular areas because you're gonna be close to your car. There's gonna be people around that can help you out, and it's just gonna be less committing. So in that kind of scenario, it's great that the iPhone provides both communication and SOS, and it's gonna be a great option for like probably 90% of people out there. I think what this trip reinforced for me is that having reliable gear really it should be the priority when you're out on solo trips. You might have to sacrifice a little bit of comfort, maybe a little bit of ease of use, but if the gear is gonna work in a pinch, then that's gonna be the number one thing that you need to be looking out for. But I also know that you can be safe out on solo trips. It definitely takes some getting used to. It takes some kind of building trust in your gear. But once you get out and you're in these beautiful environments, it's super peaceful, super amazing. And this is what recharges me. So I'm glad that I can make it happen, glad that I can feel safe doing it. And I can't wait for the next adventure. If you want to see the ultimate reliability test of the X-Dome, go check out this video right up here. I set up 6 tents in extreme wind and see how they do. Some of them failed and some of them did really, really well.